Let's talk about carbon compounds today. We're going to talk about why carbon is so important and some of the few macromolecules that are necessary for survival. Let's first talk a little bit about carbon. Let's talk about what it bonds with and how that helps to make up life's molecules. Carbon will be able to bond with many elements because of its structure. A lot of the elements are the ones we've talked about previously: hydrogen, oxygen, and then some phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen in order to form the molecules of life. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. Remember, that means outer shell. It has 2 in its first shell, 4 in its outer shell. This leaves 4 places in which elements can bond. A lot of times it will bond with hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, sulfur, and even nitrogen. Living organisms are made up of the molecules that consist of carbon and the other elements. One of the versatile things about carbon is that it can also bond to itself. This gives carbon the ability to make lots of different structures. Some are very simple and some are complex. It can be in single, double, or will even form triple covalent bonds. You can get chains of carbon, and you can even have carbon that will form rings. There are 4 different groups of macromolecules that we're going to discuss. The first one today will be carbohydrates. We'll talk about some others later. Macro means big, so these are actually giant molecules. They're made from thousands or even hundreds of thousands of really small molecules put together. Some of them are formed by a process called polymerization. This is when you actually have large compounds built by joining smaller ones together. Over here, you see what are called monomers. Mono means one, poly means many, so this is the many monomers stuck together. This again talks about the many monomers forming together to make the polymers through what is called polymerization. The monomers can actually be identical to each other or different. The 4 major groups of macromolecules are carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, and proteins. Today we will talk about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are compounds made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, usually in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. Carbo for carbon, hydrate for the H2Os. Living things use carbohydrates as their main source of energy. The breakdown of the sugars, such as glucose, helps the cells have immediate energy. Plants, some animals, and other organisms use carbohydrates for structural purposes. Carbohydrates are typically our sugars. Many organisms will store extra sugar as a complex carbohydrate called starch. The monomers are a simple molecule called glucose. Hooked together, they are a polymer called starch. Simple sugars made of one single molecule are called monosaccharides. Besides glucose, there are some monosaccharides called galactose, which is a component of milk. You have fructose, which is in many fruits. Ordinary table sugar, called sucrose, is actually what we call a disaccharide. It's formed by putting 2 molecules together, a glucose and a fructose. Remember that mono means 1, di means 2, and poly means many. There are also complex carbohydrates, like we talked about before, called starch. They are, again, many monomers hooked together. This is called a polysaccharide. Animals will store their excess sugar as a polysaccharide called glycogen. When the levels of glucose in your blood runs low, glycogen can be broken down into glucose, which is then released in your blood to raise your blood sugar. The glycogen stored in your muscles will supply the energy for muscle contraction. Plants do this a little differently. They don't store it as glycogen. Again, they store it as starch. That's their extra sugar. Plants also make another important polysaccharide called cellulose, which gives the plants much of their strength and rigidity.